After her betrayal, my wife demanded everything in court. Her lawyer mocked me. That old fool deserved to be cheated on. I gave a cold smile. When the judge looked at me and called me by my old nickname, they both went pale. Then the judge said 3 words. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. I never thought I'd be sitting in a divorce courtroom at 54, watching my wife of 26 years tear apart everything we'd built together. But there I was, in my worn Navy suit that Pamela had always criticized, listening to her lawyer Marcus Whitfield destroy me piece by piece with words sharper than any knife. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice dripping with contempt as he gestured toward me like I was some pathetic specimen. "My client has endured years of marriage to a man who clearly peaked in law school. We're talking about a woman who deserves so much better than this. Old fool who couldn't even keep his wife satisfied." The words hit me like physical blows, but I kept my face neutral. I'd learned long ago how to hide my emotions, especially around Pamela. She sat beside Marcus, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany table, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. At 48, she still looked stunning, the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room, the kind of woman I'd once felt lucky to call my wife. "This is a clear-cut case," Marcus continued, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the marble floor as he paced. "Mrs. Pamela Morrison deserves half of all marital assets, plus alimony that reflects the lifestyle she's accustomed to. Her husband," he practically spat the word, "this bumbling, mediocre lawyer who's barely managed to keep a small practice afloat, has been holding her back for decades." I almost smiled at that. Almost. The courtroom was nearly empty except for us and a few court officials. Pamela had insisted on keeping things private, though I suspected it had more to do with her shame about divorcing me than any concern for my reputation. After all, what would her country club friends think if they knew she was leaving her husband for her personal trainer? Though that's not quite how she'd spun the story to Marcus. "Furthermore," Marcus said, pulling out a thick folder, "we have documented evidence of Mr. Morrison's negligence as a provider. Look at their tax returns from the past 5 years. Barely $200,000 annually. Meanwhile, my client has had to scrimp and save, denied the finer things in life she deserves." Pamela nodded vigorously, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I knew those tears were as fake as her last 3 Botox appointments, but she'd always been a convincing actress. That's how she'd managed to carry on her affair with Jake, her 28-year-old trainer, for the past 2 years without me suspecting a thing. Until I found them in our bed 3 months ago. The memory still burned. I'd come home early from court, excited to share news about a case I'd won. I'd bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, calling her name, only to find my wife of 26 years wrapped around a man young enough to be our son. The sound she made when she saw me, that sharp intake of breath, still echoed in my ears during sleepless nights. "Adam," she'd said, not even bothering to cover herself, "this isn't what it looks like." But it was exactly what it looked like. And from the smug expression on Jake's face, I realized this wasn't their first time. This was routine. The defendant's own wife has testified to his emotional distance, his inability to provide adequately, and his complete failure as a husband, Marcus was saying now, his voice rising for dramatic effect. This man, and I use that term loosely, couldn't even satisfy his own wife. She had to seek companionship elsewhere just to feel human again. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Even the court reporter looked sympathetic toward Pamela. Marcus was good at his job, I had to give him that. He'd painted me as a pathetic failure, a man who'd driven his beautiful wife into another man's arms through sheer incompetence. If only they knew the truth. "Your Honor," Marcus said, turning to face the bench where the judge had yet to appear, "my client is asking for what any reasonable woman would deserve after wasting the best years of her life on this disappointment. Half of all assets, including the house on Maple Street, the vacation property, and spousal support of $8,000 monthly for the next 10 years. Pamela squeezed Marcus's arm affectionately. I'd noticed how she touched him during our meetings, lingering contact that spoke of intimacy beyond the attorney-client relationship. I wondered if Jake knew about Marcus, or if Pamela was juggling both men, knowing my wife probably the latter. "She's been through enough," Marcus concluded, his voice softening as he played to an imaginary jury. 26 years of being married to a man who couldn't even provide her with the basic respect she deserved. This old burro, "Excuse me, Your Honor, this man deserved to be betrayed. Any woman would have done the same." The courtroom fell silent. Even I had to admit Marcus had delivered a masterful performance. If I didn't know better, I might have felt sorry for Pamela myself. The wronged wife, trapped in a loveless marriage to an inadequate man, finally finding the courage to seek happiness elsewhere. But I did know better. I knew about the credit cards she'd hidden from me. I knew about the money she'd been secretly transferring to offshore accounts. I knew about the properties she'd purchased under her maiden name, and most importantly, I knew exactly who would be walking through that door in about 30 seconds. I caught Marcus checking his Rolex, a gift from Pamela, though he probably didn't realize I knew that. He was confident, relaxed, already savoring his victory. Pamela was practically glowing, probably calculating how she'd spend her newfound wealth. That's when I allowed myself a small smile. "Something amusing, Mr. Morrison?" Marcus asked, his voice sharp with irritation. "Just thinking about old friends," I replied quietly. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and I heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching the bench. Pamela and Marcus were too busy gloating to pay attention, but I turned slightly in my chair, my heart beating faster. After all these years, some things never changed. The footsteps stopped, and I heard the rustle of robes as someone took their position at the judge's bench. Marcus was still shuffling papers, preparing for what he assumed would be his easy victory, when the gavel struck once. "All rise," the bailiff announced. We stood as one, and I felt that familiar anticipation building in my chest. The same feeling I'd had years ago when everything I thought I knew about my life was about to change forever. "Court is now in session," the bailiff continued, the honorable judge presiding. I kept my eyes forward, but I could feel Pamela tense beside Marcus. Something in the atmosphere had shifted, though she couldn't quite place what it was. That's when I heard the voice that would change everything. 24 hours earlier, I'd been sitting in my modest office on Pine Street, staring at the stack of divorce papers that would officially end my marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 30 years of practicing law, I was about to become the client in my own specialty area. My office was nothing spectacular. A few law books, family photos I'd need to take down soon, and a desk I'd bought secondhand when I first opened my practice. Pamela had always been embarrassed by the place, especially when we attended social events where other wives bragged about their husbands' corner offices in glass towers downtown. "Why can't you be more like Richard Caldwell?" she'd asked me just last month, referring to her friend Monica's husband. "He made partner at Sterling and Associates. They have a house in the Hamptons, Adam. A house in the Hamptons." What Pamela didn't know, what she'd never bothered to learn, was that I could have had a corner office anytime I wanted. I could have had the Hamptons house, the country club membership, the lifestyle she so desperately craved. But there were reasons I'd chosen this different path, reasons that went back long before I'd met her. I'd started my legal career with such different dreams. Fresh out of law school, I'd been recruited by 3 of the city's most prestigious firms. Everybody wanted the young hotshot who'd graduated summa cum laude, who'd served as editor of the Law Review, who'd been personally recommended by Professor William Hayes. The William Hayes, the man who'd written the definitive textbook on constitutional law. But I'd turned them all down. Instead, I'd taken a job with legal aid, defending people who couldn't afford representation. It didn't pay much, but it fed my soul in ways that corporate law never could have. I spent my days fighting for single mothers facing eviction, elderly people being scammed by predatory lenders, immigrants navigating a system designed to exclude them. That's where I'd met David Chen. David had been a young public defender then, barely 26 years old, and drowning in caseload. He'd been assigned to represent a homeless veteran accused of assault, a case that seemed hopeless from the start. The evidence was stacked against his client, the The prosecutor was pushing for maximum sentencing, and David was in over his head. I'd been in the courthouse filing paperwork when I saw him in the hallway, practically hyperventilating as he reviewed his notes. Something about his desperation reminded me of myself in those early days, so I'd approached him. "Rough case?" I'd asked. David had looked up with grateful eyes. "The worst. My client is innocent. I know he is, but I can't prove it. The prosecutor has 3 witnesses, video evidence, and my guy can't even remember where he was that night because of his PTSD episodes." I'd studied the case file David showed me, and within an hour, I'd spotted the holes in the prosecution's argument. The timestamps on the video didn't match the police report. The witnesses had been coached. Most importantly, the alleged assault had happened during a veteran support group meeting that my client had attended religiously every week for 3 months. "You need to subpoena the group leader's attendance records," I'd told David, "and check the building's security footage from the community center. If your client was there, you'll have proof." David had stared at me like I'd performed magic. "How did you see all that?" "Experience," I'd said, "and the fact that sometimes the obvious answer is wrong." The case had been dismissed 2 weeks later. David's client was cleared, and David himself had gotten a commendation from the public defender's office for his brilliant legal strategy. I'd never asked for credit, never even given David my name. I'd just been happy to help, but David had tracked me down anyway. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," he'd said when he showed up at my office. "You saved that man's life. You saved my career." I'd waved off his gratitude. "Just pay it forward," I told him. And David had done exactly that. He'd thrown himself into his work with renewed passion, taking on the cases nobody else wanted, fighting for the forgotten and overlooked. Within 5 years, he'd been promoted to senior public defender. Within 10, he'd been elected to a judgeship. And through it all, we'd maintained a quiet friendship. We'd meet for coffee every few months, sometimes to discuss legal philosophy, sometimes just to catch up on life. David would tell me about his cases, the challenges of being a judge, the weight of making decisions that affected real people's lives. I'd share my own stories from legal aid, later from my private practice, when I'd finally opened my own firm. "You should be on the bench yourself," David had told me more than once. "You have the mind for it, the temperament. Why do you keep limiting yourself to this small practice?" I'd never given him the full answer. How could I explain that Pamela had slowly but systematically convinced me I wasn't good enough for bigger things? That she'd spent years undermining my confidence, making me believe that my modest success was the best I could hope for? "I'm happy where I am," I'd always replied. But was I? Sitting in my office yesterday preparing for a divorce that would strip away the last pretense of the life I'd built, I'd finally been forced to confront that question honestly. The truth was, I'd been living in a fog for years. Pamela's constant criticism had worn me down like water on stone, slowly eroding my sense of self-worth until I'd begun to believe her version of reality. According to Pamela, I was a failed lawyer, a disappointing husband, a man who'd never lived up to his potential. "Look at Marcus Whitfield," she'd said just last week as we prepared for mediation. "Now there's a real lawyer. He drives a BMW, lives in Riverside Hills, belongs to the country club. That's what success looks like, Adam, not this." She'd gestured dismissively around my office. Marcus Whitfield. Even thinking his name made my stomach clench with a mixture of anger and something that might have been pity. Pamela had chosen him as her attorney after a friend's recommendation, though I suspected the recommendation had come with benefits beyond legal advice. Marcus was everything Pamela thought she wanted in a man. Flashy, confident, expensive. He wore suits that cost more than some people made in a month, drove a car that screamed wealth, and treated everyone around him like they should be grateful for his attention. What Pamela didn't know was that Marcus and I had a history. 15 years ago, Marcus had been a junior associate at Brennan & Burke, one of the city's most prestigious firms. He'd been ambitious, ruthless, and completely without scruples. He'd also been embezzling money from client accounts to fund his lifestyle. I'd been retained by one of his victims, an elderly widow whose settlement money had mysteriously disappeared from the firm's trust account. It had taken me 6 months of careful investigation, but I'd eventually traced the missing funds back to Marcus. I'd had enough evidence to send him to prison. Instead, I'd done something that still kept me awake some nights. I'd given him a choice: resign quietly, make full restitution to all his victims, and never practice law again or face criminal charges. Marcus had chosen resignation. He'd disappeared for 3 years, reportedly working in real estate in another state. When he'd returned, he'd somehow managed to get his law license reinstated and had slowly rebuilt his practice. He'd been more careful since then, but I'd always wondered if he'd truly changed or just gotten better at hiding his crimes. Now, sitting across from him in divorce proceedings, I had my answer. The way he'd systematically tried to hide Pamela's assets, the questionable tactics he'd employed, the barely concealed contempt in his voice when he spoke to me. Marcus Whitfield was the same man he'd always been. And tomorrow, in that courtroom, he was about to get the shock of his life. I'd checked the court schedule 3 times to be sure. Judge David Chen was presiding over family court this month. The same David Chen whose career I'd helped save all those years ago. The same David Chen who'd never forgotten a kindness or a friend. I wasn't counting on favoritism. David was too ethical for that. But I was counting on something else. David's ability to see through lies and recognize the truth when it was presented clearly. And I had so much truth to present. The files in my desk contained 2 years' worth of careful documentation. Bank records showing Pamela's secret accounts. Credit card statements for purchases she'd hidden. Property deeds for investments she'd made without my knowledge. Most damning of all, a recording of her conversation with Marcus where they'd discussed their plan to paint me as an incompetent failure while hiding her actual wealth. Pamela thought she was so clever, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated me completely. "Good morning, counsel. Please be seated." The voice that filled the courtroom was calm, measured, and professional, exactly as I remembered it. But I could hear the slight change in tone when David's eyes found mine across the room. 20 years of friendship don't disappear just because you're wearing judicial robes. Marcus was still organizing his papers, completely oblivious to the shift that had just occurred in the room's dynamics. Pamela was checking her reflection in her compact mirror, probably making sure she looked appropriately victimized for the judge's benefit. "This is the matter of Morrison versus Morrison," David announced, settling into his chair behind the bench. "I see we have Mr. Marcus Whitfield representing the petitioner, and Mr. Adam Morrison appearing pro se for the respondent." Marcus stood with his usual theatrical flair. "Yes, Your Honor. Marcus Whitfield of Whitfield and Associates representing Mrs. Pamela Morrison in her petition for dissolution of marriage." David's gaze moved to me, and for just a moment I saw the slightest hint of a smile at the corners of his mouth. "Mr. Morrison, I see you're representing yourself today." "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, standing as well. "I believe I'm capable of handling my own affairs." "I'm sure you are." David's tone was perfectly neutral, but there was something in his eyes that made Marcus glance between us with the first hint of uncertainty I'd seen from him. The thing about David Chen was that he'd always been impossible to read when he wanted to be. Even as a young public defender, he'd had the ability to keep his emotions completely hidden during proceedings, only to surprise everyone with his brilliant arguments. Now, as a judge, that skill had been refined to an art form. "Mr. Whitfield," David continued, "I've reviewed the preliminary filings in this case. You're seeking a division of marital assets and substantial spousal support for your client. Please present your opening argument." Marcus straightened his tie and launched into the same performance he'd been rehearsing all morning. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of a woman who has been failed by her husband in every conceivable way. Mrs. Morrison has endured 26 years of marriage to a man who has consistently underperformed as a provider, as a partner, and as a human being." I watched David's face carefully. His expression remained neutral, but I knew him well enough to recognize the slight tightening around his eyes. David had always despised lawyers who tried to turn family court into a theatrical production. "My client has been forced to live in circumstances far below what any reasonable woman would expect," Marcus continued, warming to his theme. While other wives enjoy the fruits of their husband's success, Mrs. Morrison has had to scrimp and save, denied even basic luxuries because of her husband's limitations. Pamela dabbed at her eyes again, playing her part to perfection. She'd dressed carefully for today, a modest blue dress that made her look vulnerable, minimal jewelry, her hair pulled back in a simple style, the grieving wife, wronged by an inadequate husband. Furthermore, Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Morrison's emotional neglect drove my client to seek companionship elsewhere. While we don't condone adultery, we must understand it in context. A woman can only endure so much before she reaches her breaking point. Marcus gestured toward me with obvious disdain. This man, and I use that term charitably, has been living off his wife's emotional labor for decades while contributing virtually nothing to their partnership. The very fact that he's representing himself today demonstrates his arrogance and his complete disconnect from reality. David's pen moved across his notepad, but his expression gave nothing away. And what specifically are you seeking, Mr. Whitfield? Half of all marital assets, Your Honor, including the family home on Maple Street and the vacation property in Lake George. Additionally, we're requesting spousal support of $8,000 per month for 10 years, which we believe is reasonable given Mrs. Morrison's age and the limited job skills she's developed during her marriage. I almost laughed at that last part. Pamela had an MBA from Northwestern and had worked in marketing for 12 years before deciding she preferred being a housewife. Limited job skills, indeed. I see, David said, making another note. Mr. Morrison, how do you respond to these requests? I stood slowly, feeling calmer than I had in months. This was it, the moment when everything I'd discovered, everything I'd carefully documented, would finally see daylight. Your Honor, I believe my wife and her attorney are operating under several fundamental misunderstandings about our financial situation. Marcus let out a dismissive snort. Your Honor, the defendant's own tax returns clearly show... Mr. Whitfield, David's voice carried just enough edge to cut Marcus off mid-sentence. I didn't ask for your commentary. Mr. Morrison, please continue. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the first folder. Your Honor, while it's true that my personal tax returns show modest income, they don't reflect the full scope of my financial activities. You see, I've been what you might call a silent partner in several business ventures. Pamela's head snapped up, her perfectly composed expression flickering for the first time. Marcus frowned, clearly not liking where this was headed. Could you elaborate, Mr. Morrison? David asked, though I could tell he was already intrigued. Certainly, Your Honor. 15 years ago, I began investing in real estate partnerships, technology startups, and other ventures through a series of limited liability companies. My wife was aware that I had some investments, but she never showed interest in the details. This wasn't entirely true. Pamela had shown interest, but only in spending the money, never in understanding where it came from. When our lifestyle had gradually improved over the years, better vacations, a nicer car for her, renovations to the house, she'd simply assumed I was finally getting my act together as a lawyer. These investments have been quite successful, I continued. In fact, they've generated substantially more income than my law practice ever did. Marcus was no longer looking confident. Your Honor, we've reviewed all financial disclosures based on what my wife provided, I interrupted smoothly. Since she never asked for specifics and I never volunteered them, her information was necessarily incomplete. David leaned forward slightly. Mr. Morrison, are you saying there are undisclosed assets in this marriage? Not undisclosed, Your Honor, simply not discussed. Everything was reported on appropriate tax returns and legal documents. My wife simply chose not to involve herself in the financial details of our marriage beyond writing checks from our joint account. I could see Pamela's face growing pale as she began to understand the implications. All those years she'd criticized my lack of ambition, my small practice, my failure to provide the lifestyle she wanted. And all along I'd been quietly building something much larger than she'd ever imagined. How substantial are these assets, Mr. Morrison? David asked. I opened a second folder and handed copies to both Marcus and the court clerk. The current value of my investment portfolio is approximately $12 million. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Marcus's mouth actually fell open, and Pamela looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Even David, despite his judicial composure, allowed his eyebrows to rise slightly. "12 million?" Marcus sputtered, scanning the documents I'd provided. How is this possible? Careful investment, compound interest, and the wisdom to reinvest profits rather than spend them, I replied calmly. Also the advantage of having a wife who was completely uninterested in understanding our finances beyond her monthly allowance. Pamela found her voice at last. "Adam, what are you talking about? You never told me about any of this." "You never asked, dear," I said, my voice perfectly level. "Every time I tried to discuss investments or business opportunities, you'd change the subject or complain that I was being boring. You preferred to focus on why I wasn't more like other husbands, why I didn't drive a flashier car or belong to the country club." David was studying the financial documents with obvious interest. "Mr. Morrison, these investment records show consistent activity over the past 15 years. Can you explain why your wife wasn't aware of this wealth?" "Your Honor, I tried many times to involve my wife in our financial planning. She consistently expressed that she found such discussions tedious and preferred to leave money matters to me. Her exact words, on multiple occasions, were that she didn't want to bother with boring business stuff as long as there was enough money for her needs." This was absolutely true. I had tried, especially in the early years, to share my excitement about successful investments or new opportunities. But Pamela had always brushed aside such conversations, more interested in planning vacations or redecorating the house than understanding how those things were funded. What she was unaware of, I continued, was that I established separate accounts for my investment activities to avoid any confusion with our household finances. The joint account she managed was essentially her allowance, funded by transfers from my business accounts. Marcus was frantically flipping through pages, trying to find some angle to attack. "Your Honor, this is clearly an attempt to hide assets from—" "Actually, Mr. Whitfield," David interrupted, "these documents appear to be quite thorough and transparent. Every investment is properly documented, with clear paper trails and tax records, Mr. Morrison. Were any of these investments made with funds that could be considered marital property?" I smiled. This was the question I'd been hoping for. "Your Honor, the initial investment capital came from an inheritance I received from my grandfather's estate shortly after our marriage. Per our prenuptial agreement, inheritances were to remain separate property." The blood drained completely from Marcus's face. "Prenuptial agreement?" Pamela was staring at me in shock. "Adam, we don't have a prenup." "Actually, we do," I said, producing another folder. "You signed it 2 days before our wedding. Perhaps you don't remember because you were more focused on the ceremony arrangements, but your signature is quite clear." I handed copies of the 26-year-old document to David and Marcus. Pamela's signature was right there at the bottom, along with the notarization and witness signatures. "This document clearly states that any inheritance received by either party during the marriage remains the separate property of the recipient," David read aloud. "It also specifies that any investments made with separate property retain their separate character." Marcus looked like a man watching his entire case collapse in real time. "But, Your Honor, surely after 26 years of marriage—" "The law is quite clear, Mr. Whitfield," David said firmly. "Separate property remains separate, regardless of the length of the marriage, unless there's clear evidence of intent to commingle assets." I could see Pamela's mind racing, probably trying to remember signing the prenup, probably wondering what other crucial details she'd overlooked in her rush to become Mrs. Morrison. But I wasn't finished yet. I had one more surprise that would change everything they thought they knew about this divorce. "Your Honor," I said, reaching for my final folder, "there's one more matter I need to address regarding my wife's petition." David nodded. "Please proceed." "It concerns the allegations of my failure as a provider and the circumstances that led to my wife's relationship with her personal trainer." Pamela's eyes went wide with sudden panic. She obviously knew what was coming, even if Marcus didn't. This was about to get very interesting. I opened the final folder with deliberate calm, watching as Pamela's face went from pale to absolutely ashen. She knew what was coming. After 26 years of marriage, she could read my expressions better than anyone, except when it came to understanding the depth of my knowledge about her activities. "Your Honor," I began, "while I don't dispute that my wife sought companionship outside our marriage, I believe the court should understand the true timeline and motivations behind her actions." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Something in my tone had changed, and even he could sense that the ground was about to shift beneath his feet again. "Mr. Morrison," David said, "are you prepared to present evidence regarding these allegations?" "I am, Your Honor." I pulled out a thick manila envelope. "What I'm about to present may be disturbing, but it's essential for understanding the true nature of this marriage and the character of the parties involved." Pamela's breathing had become shallow and rapid. She grabbed Marcus's arm, her manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "Marcus," she whispered urgently, but he shushed her, his attention fixed on what I was about to reveal. "Your Honor, my wife didn't seek companionship because of my alleged failures as a husband. She began planning the end of our marriage approximately 3 years ago, not because she was unhappy, but because she believed she had found a more lucrative opportunity." I handed the first set of documents to David. "These are bank records showing that my wife opened secret accounts in her maiden name beginning 38 months ago. She's been systematically transferring money from our joint household account, money I provided for family expenses, into these hidden accounts." David examined the papers carefully while Marcus sputtered protests. "Your Honor, Mrs. Morrison was simply being prudent about her financial security." "That's not all, Mr. Whitfield," I interrupted. "Mrs. Morrison also took out 3 credit cards without my knowledge, using our jointly owned home as collateral. The total debt accumulated on these cards is approximately $85,000. Pamela made a small choking sound. Marcus grabbed the documents from David's clerk, his eyes scanning frantically. "But here's where it gets interesting," I continued. "The purchases on these credit cards weren't for household expenses or personal necessities. They were for expensive gifts, luxury hotel stays, and travel expenses, all for her relationship with Jake Patterson, her personal trainer." I produced another set of papers. Credit card receipts showing payments to high-end restaurants, boutique hotels, and jewelry stores. The pattern becomes clear when you cross-reference the dates with my wife's supposed girls' trips and visiting her sister excuses. David was examining each document methodically. "Mr. Morrison, this suggests premeditation rather than the emotional breakdown Mr. Whitfield described." "Exactly, Your Honor. But it gets worse." I pulled out a small digital recorder. 3 months ago, when I discovered the affair, I didn't immediately confront my wife. Instead, I installed a voice-activated recording device in our home office. Marcus shot to his feet. "Your Honor, recordings made without consent are perfectly legal in this state when made in one's own home," David said firmly. "Mr. Morrison, you may proceed." I pressed play, and Pamela's voice filled the courtroom, clear and unmistakable. "No, Marcus, you don't understand. Adam is sitting on a fortune and he's too stupid to even realize what he has. Those boring investments he's always mumbling about? I had Jake hack into his computer last month. We're talking millions, Marcus. Millions." Marcus's voice came through the speaker next. "Are you certain? Because if we're going to do this, we need to be absolutely sure about the numbers. I'm telling you, he's worth at least 10 times what he declares on those pathetic tax returns. The man's been playing poor while sitting on a gold mine. But here's the beautiful part. He's kept everything so separate that he probably thinks I can't touch it in a divorce. And Jake? Where does he fit into all this?" Pamela's laugh was cold and calculating. "Jake is a convenient distraction. Adam needed to catch me with someone, needed to feel betrayed and heartbroken so he wouldn't fight the divorce. Jake thinks he's going to get a piece of the settlement, but once this is over..." Her voice trailed off with obvious implications. I stopped the recording. The courtroom was dead silent except for the sound of Pamela's ragged breathing. "There's more," I said quietly, "including conversations where my wife and Mr. Whitfield discussed strategies for portraying me as mentally incompetent, financially irresponsible, and emotionally abusive. Marcus had gone completely white. He was staring at the recorder like it was a bomb that had just exploded in his lap. "Your Honor," he stammered, "I need to request a recess to consult with my client." "I don't think so, Mr. Whitfield," David said, his voice carrying the first edge of genuine anger I'd heard. "Mr. Morrison, please continue." I played another section of the recording. "The key is to make him look like a failure," Marcus's voice explained. "Portray him as a man who couldn't provide for his wife, who drove her into another man's arms through sheer inadequacy. Judges eat that up. They see the older man, the younger trainer, and they assume it's a classic midlife crisis affair." "But what about his investments?" Pamela asked. "That's why we need to move fast. If he's as clueless as you say, we can get a quick settlement before he realizes what he's actually worth. Push for immediate division of all known assets and substantial alimony. By the time he figures out what happened, it'll be too late to change anything." I stopped the recording again and looked directly at Marcus. "Your Honor, I believe this constitutes conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury, and several other felonies." Marcus was frantically shuffling papers, looking like a man drowning in his own incompetence. "Your Honor, these recordings are taken out of context." "Mr. Whitfield," David's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade, "are you telling me that's not your voice on that recording?" Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Pamela, who was staring at her hands in her lap, and I could see the exact moment when he realized she had destroyed both of their careers. "Furthermore," I continued, pulling out yet another folder, "I have documented evidence that Mr. Whitfield has been engaged in a sexual relationship with my wife for the past 8 months, which represents a clear conflict of interest and violation of legal ethics." I presented photographs taken by the private investigator I'd hired. Marcus and Pamela entering his apartment building together. Marcus and Pamela at restaurants in the next county where they thought they wouldn't be recognized. Marcus and Pamela kissing in the parking garage of his office building. "Jake Patterson was never my wife's only affair partner," I explained. "He was simply the one she allowed me to discover. Her real relationship has been with her attorney, who has been using privileged information about our marriage to plan this elaborate fraud scheme." David was studying the photographs with an expression of disgust that he wasn't bothering to hide. "Mr. Whitfield, these images appear to be quite recent. Can you explain your relationship with your client?" Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. "Your Honor, that is, Mrs. Morrison and I, have been conspiring to defraud me of millions of dollars while violating attorney-client privilege and committing adultery," I finished helpfully. "Yes, that's exactly what they've been doing." Pamela finally looked up, her eyes blazing with desperate fury. "You bastard!" she hissed at me. "You knew all along, and you let you hang yourself?" I asked mildly. "Yes, I did. I wanted to see exactly how far you'd go, how many laws you'd break, how many people you'd hurt in pursuit of money you were never entitled to." I turned back to David. "Your Honor, I'm not just defending against this fraudulent divorce petition. I'm filing criminal complaints against both Mrs. Morrison and Mr. Whitfield for conspiracy, fraud, and in Mr. Whitfield's case, gross violation of legal ethics." The blood had completely drained from Marcus's face. He was probably calculating how many years in prison he was facing, not to mention the certain end of his legal career. "But I'm not finished yet," I said, reaching for one final document. "There's something else the court needs to know about the timeline of events." Pamela's eyes went wide with fresh panic. She knew there was more, and she knew it was going to be bad. "Your Honor, the affair with Jake Patterson didn't begin 2 years ago as my wife claimed. It began 4 years ago, shortly after she convinced me to add her name to the deed of our family home. I presented the documentation. As you can see, my wife has been planning this divorce for much longer than even the recordings suggest. She's been systematically positioning herself to maximize her financial gain while minimizing any consequences for her actions." David was shaking his head slowly as he reviewed the evidence. "Mr. Morrison, this appears to be one of the most calculated attempts at marriage fraud I've seen in 20 years on the bench." "It is, Your Honor. And there's one more thing." I looked directly at Pamela, who was now openly crying. Not the fake tears she'd used earlier, but tears of genuine panic and desperation. "My wife is currently 3 months pregnant. The courtroom erupted. Marcus dropped his papers, Pamela let out a wail of anguish, and even David couldn't maintain his judicial composure completely. "And based on the timeline of our estrangement," I continued calmly, "the child is definitely not mine." That's when Pamela finally broke completely, sobbing hysterically as the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. She hadn't just lost her marriage and her scheme to steal my money, she'd lost everything. And she was about to face criminal charges while pregnant with another man's child. Marcus was staring at her in horror, probably realizing that his legal career wasn't the only thing about to be destroyed. But I still had one final card to play. The revelation about Pamela's pregnancy had sent shockwaves through the courtroom, but I wasn't finished. In fact, I was just getting to the part that would truly devastate everything they thought they knew about our marriage and my so-called failure as a provider. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos around me, "while Mrs. Morrison and Mr. Whitfield have been plotting to steal what they believed was my modest fortune, they've overlooked something crucial about my actual financial situation." David leaned forward, clearly intrigued, despite the bombshells I'd already dropped. "Please elaborate, Mr. Morrison." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a leather portfolio I'd been saving for this exact moment. The $12 million in investments I mentioned earlier, that's just my personal portfolio. What my wife never knew, what she never bothered to learn despite 26 years of marriage, is that I'm not just Adam Morrison, small-town lawyer. Marcus was still reeling from the pregnancy revelation, but something in my tone made him look up with fresh dread. "I am the silent senior partner in Chen, Patterson & Associates." The silence that followed was deafening. David's eyebrows shot up. Even he hadn't known this detail. Marcus's mouth fell open, and Pamela stopped crying long enough to stare at me in complete shock. "Furthermore," I continued, "I am the primary investor and board chairman of Morrison Development Group, which owns 17 commercial properties throughout the tri-state area. I am also the founding partner of Blue Ridge Capital Management, which oversees investment portfolios for high-net-worth individuals totaling approximately $87 million in assets under management." I handed the documentation to David, watching as his judicial composure finally cracked slightly. Even after 30 years of friendship, he was learning things about me he'd never suspected. "The total value of my business interests," I continued calmly, "is approximately $43 million. Combined with my personal investments, real estate holdings, and liquid assets, my net worth is just over $58 million. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear Pamela's ragged breathing. Marcus looked like he was about to faint. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, staring at me in amazement. "Your Honor," I said, "for the past 15 years, I've been one of the wealthiest men in this county. My wife never knew because she never asked. She was too busy criticizing my small practice and my lack of ambition to notice that I was quietly building an empire." Pamela found her voice at last, though it came out as barely a whisper. "That's impossible. Adam, you drive a 10-year-old Honda, you wear suits for Men's Warehouse, we shop at Target." "Yes," I replied simply. "Because those things don't define success, Pamela. You always measured worth by appearances, by flashy displays of wealth. I measured it by substance, by building something lasting and meaningful." I turned back to David. "Your Honor, my wife's ignorance of our true financial situation isn't due to my secrecy or deception. It's due to her complete disinterest in anything that didn't directly benefit her immediate gratification." I pulled out another folder, this one containing years of documentation. These are records of every attempt I made to involve my wife in our financial planning, dinner reservations at restaurants where I'd planned to discuss business opportunities, reservations she canceled because she preferred shopping with friends, scheduled meetings with financial advisors that she refused to attend because they were boring, invitations to business social events that she declined because the people weren't interesting enough. The picture I was painting was becoming clear to everyone in the room. Pamela hadn't been shut out of my financial life. She had actively chosen to ignore it in favor of focusing on superficial concerns. On 17 separate occasions over the past decade, I continued, I attempted to add my wife's name to various business accounts and investment portfolios. Each time she told me she didn't want to be bothered with paperwork and that I should handle the boring stuff myself. Marcus was frantically scribbling notes, probably trying to find some angle to salvage his case. But we both knew it was hopeless. His client hadn't just committed fraud, she'd been willfully ignorant of the very wealth she was now trying to steal. Your Honor, I said, I want to be absolutely clear about something. My wife didn't leave me because I was a failure. She didn't seek comfort in another man's arms because I couldn't provide for her. She betrayed our marriage because she thought she had found an easy way to upgrade to a wealthier lifestyle without putting in any effort to understand or contribute to the wealth we already had. I looked directly at Pamela, who was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. The tragedy is that if she had simply stayed faithful, if she had shown even minimal interest in our actual life together, instead of the fantasy life she wanted, she would have had access to more money than she could spend in 3 lifetimes. David was studying the business documents with obvious fascination. Mr. Morrison, these corporate structures are quite sophisticated. How long have you been planning this level of financial independence? Since before I met my wife, Your Honor. My goal was always to build enough wealth to retire early and focus on pro bono work for people who truly needed legal help. I wanted to reach a point where I could practice law for justice rather than money. This was absolutely true. Everything I'd built had been designed to give me the freedom to help people who couldn't afford good legal representation. The irony wasn't lost on me that my wife's greed had prevented me from achieving that dream. The saddest part, I continued, is that I achieved that goal 3 years ago. I've been ready to retire from commercial law and dedicate myself to helping the underprivileged. But every time I tried to discuss it with my wife, she showed no interest in a future that didn't involve country clubs and luxury vacations. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. Your Honor, even if Mr. Morrison has hidden these assets, I haven't hidden anything, I interrupted firmly. Every business entity, every investment, every dollar has been properly reported to the IRS and appropriate regulatory bodies. The only person these assets were hidden from was my wife, and only because she actively chose to remain ignorant of them. I pulled out one final document, a thick legal brief I'd prepared months earlier. Your Honor, I'm countersuing for dissolution of marriage based on adultery, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. I'm also seeking full restitution for the $85,000 my wife stole from our joint accounts, plus damages for the emotional distress caused by her systematic deception. David accepted the countersuit papers, scanning them quickly. Mr. Morrison, you're also requesting that all assets be classified as separate property? Yes, Your Honor. Based on the prenuptial agreement my wife signed, her documented disinterest in our financial affairs, and the evidence of her fraudulent intent, I believe the law is clear that she has no claim to any marital assets whatsoever. Pamela's sobs had turned into hyperventilating gasps. The reality of her situation was finally sinking in. She wasn't going to get half of $12 million. She wasn't going to get anything. Worse, she was facing criminal charges, the end of her affair with Marcus, and the prospect of raising Jake's child as a single mother with no income. Furthermore, I added, I'm requesting that the court order an immediate forensic accounting of all joint accounts to determine the full extent of my wife's unauthorized transfers and expenditures. Marcus made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. Your Honor, surely after 26 years of marriage, Mrs. Morrison deserves some consideration. Mr. Whitfield, David's voice was ice cold, your client has committed fraud, adultery, and conspiracy. She's carrying another man's child while attempting to steal millions of dollars from her husband. What exactly do you think she deserves? The question hung in the air like a sword. Marcus had no answer because there was no answer. Pamela had gambled everything on a scheme that depended on my being too stupid or too weak to fight back. She had lost in the most spectacular way possible. Your Honor, I said quietly, I don't want vengeance. I don't want to destroy my wife's life any more than she's already destroyed it herself. I simply want my freedom, my assets protected, and the right to move forward with my life without the burden of supporting someone who has betrayed me so completely." David nodded slowly. "Mr. Morrison, given the evidence presented today, I'm prepared to rule immediately on the primary issues of this case." Pamela looked up with desperate hope, probably thinking there was still some chance for mercy. Marcus straightened his tie, trying to maintain some semblance of professional dignity. But I knew David well enough to recognize the expression on his face. Justice was about to be served, and it was going to be absolute. David straightened in his chair, his expression settling into the stern mask of judicial authority I'd seen him wear in his toughest cases. The easy familiarity we'd shared as friends was completely absent now. This was Judge Chen delivering justice, and everyone in the courtroom could feel the weight of that responsibility. "Before I rule on the dissolution petition," David began, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom, "I want to address the criminal conduct that has been revealed in these proceedings." He turned to Marcus first. "Mr. Whitfield, you are hereby held in contempt of court for your violations of legal ethics, your conspiracy to commit fraud, and your abuse of the attorney-client relationship. Your conduct is a disgrace to the legal profession." Marcus's face had gone gray. He was staring at the table, probably calculating how many years his law license had left, which was 0. "Furthermore," David continued, "I am ordering the bailiff to notify the State Bar Association immediately. Mr. Whitfield, you will surrender your law license pending a full investigation, and I am recommending disbarment proceedings be initiated immediately." Marcus slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. 30 years of legal practice, destroyed in a single morning by his own greed and stupidity. David then turned his attention to Pamela, who was still crying softly into her hands. "Mrs. Morrison, your conduct throughout this marriage has been deplorable. However, given your pregnancy and the fact that you are about to face significant life challenges, I'm going to focus on the legal remedies rather than additional punishment." I saw a flicker of hope cross Pamela's face, but David wasn't finished. "Regarding the dissolution petition," he announced, "I hereby grant Mr. Morrison's countersuit for divorce based on adultery and fraud. The original petition filed by Mrs. Morrison is dismissed with prejudice." Pamela's sob caught in her throat. "As for the division of assets," David continued, consulting his notes, "based on the prenuptial agreement signed by both parties, the evidence of Mrs. Morrison's fraudulent intent, and her documented disinterest in the financial affairs of the marriage, I rule that all assets remain the separate property of Mr. Morrison." The words hit Pamela like physical blows. No house, no money, no safety net. Mrs. Morrison will receive no spousal support, no share of marital assets, and no claim to any present or future earnings of Mr. Morrison, David declared. Furthermore, she is ordered to make full restitution of the $85,000 stolen from joint accounts, plus interest and court costs. Marcus tried one final, desperate intervention. "Your Honor, Mrs. Morrison is pregnant and will have no means of support." "Mr. Whitfield," David's voice cut through the air like a blade, "Mrs. Morrison should have considered that before committing fraud and adultery. The consequences of her actions are not this court's responsibility to remedy." He turned back to his notes. "Additionally, I am granting Mr. Morrison's request for a restraining order. Mrs. Morrison is prohibited from contacting him directly or indirectly, from coming within 500 feet of his residence or business, and from making any claims against his assets or business interests." Pamela was sobbing openly now, the reality of her situation finally and completely clear. She had gambled everything and lost everything. "Mr. Morrison," David said, his tone softening slightly, "you are granted immediate dissolution of marriage. All assets are confirmed as your separate property, and you are free to proceed with your life without any legal obligations to your former spouse." I felt a weight I'd been carrying for years suddenly lift from my shoulders. Freedom. After 26 years of criticism, manipulation, and taking my efforts for granted, I was finally free. "However," David continued, and his tone became more personal, "I want to say something Off the record." He looked directly at me, and for a moment I saw my old friend behind the judicial robes. "Adam, you could have destroyed these people completely. You had evidence of criminal conduct that could have sent them both to prison. Instead, you chose to seek only what was fair and just. That speaks to your character." I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. "Your Honor, I never wanted revenge. I just wanted the truth to come out." David smiled slightly. Justice and truth often go hand in hand. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder. As people began filing out of the courtroom, I packed my papers slowly, savoring the moment. It was over, all of it. Marcus was slumped over his table, probably contemplating a career change. Pamela was being helped to her feet by the bailiff, her dreams of easy wealth shattered beyond repair. I felt someone approach and looked up to see David, having shed his robes for a simple suit jacket. "Ace," he said quietly, using the old nickname that had started this whole revelation. "David." I stood and extended my hand, but he pulled me into a brief embrace instead. "I never knew," he said. "All these years, all those coffee meetings where you talked about wanting to do more pro bono work, you were already in a position to retire and dedicate yourself to it completely." I shrugged. "I was waiting for the right time. Turns out the right time was when my life fell apart." David laughed. "Sometimes the best things come from the worst situations. What will you do now?" I looked around the empty courtroom, thinking about the freedom that stretched ahead of me. "Remember how you always said I should be on the bench? Maybe it's time I considered that seriously. After all, I don't need to worry about the salary anymore." David's eyes lit up. "Judge Morrison. I like the sound of that." "We'll see," I said. "First, I think I'm going to take that trip to Europe I've been putting off for 15 years. Maybe write that book about constitutional law I always talked about." "You deserve it," David said. "You've earned every bit of happiness coming your way." As I walked out of the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in years. The afternoon sun was warm on my face, and for the first time in decades, I had no obligations except to myself. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my stomach clenched, thinking it might be Pamela or someone acting on her behalf. But it was from my assistant at the law firm. "Mr. Morrison, there are 3 messages from universities interested in discussing visiting professor positions. Also, the public defender's office called about a consulting opportunity. Welcome to your new life." I smiled and put the phone away without responding. Those calls could wait. Right now, I had somewhere more important to be. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in our old coffee shop, mine and David's, at the same corner table where we'd met so many times over the years to discuss law, life, and dreams. But this time, I was alone, and that felt exactly right. I ordered a simple black coffee and pulled out a legal pad. At the top of the page, I wrote, "Plans for the rest of my life." The first item was easy. Take time to remember who I am when nobody else is watching. The second was just as simple. Help people who actually need and deserve help. The third made me smile. Never again let anyone convince me I'm less than I am. As I sat there writing, I thought about Pamela, probably sitting in some lawyer's office trying to figure out how to survive as a single mother with no money and a criminal record. I thought about Marcus, whose legal career was over before the day was done. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt like the victor in some great battle. Instead, I just felt free. The wealthy man they'd tried to rob had been there all along, quietly building something meaningful while they plotted to steal what they thought were scraps. The joke was on them, but it wasn't really funny. It was just sad. I finished my coffee, folded up my legal pad, and walked out into the afternoon sunshine. Tomorrow, I would start the process of liquidating my law practice and transitioning my business interests to trusted partners. Next week, I would book that trip to Europe. But right now, I was going to drive to the small house I'd bought years ago under a corporate name, the house Pamela had never known existed, and sit on the back porch with a good book and a glass of wine. For the first time in 26 years, I was going to enjoy an evening with no criticism, no demands, no manipulation, and no lies. Just peace, quiet, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes justice really does prevail. The old Honda started up quietly, and I drove away from the courthouse where my old life had officially ended, heading toward a future that was entirely my own. Behind me, the building grew smaller in my rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. Just like my marriage, just like the man I used to be when I thought love meant accepting less than I deserved. That man was gone forever, and I couldn't have been happier about it.